So again, today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the Apple as-is valuation and the fix in just a minute. But before we do, I want to, as we get closer to the end of the semester, talk about the upcoming next couple weeks. So today, I will give the next homework assignment and the next extra credit assignment, which will both be due on Monday. So next week, we'll be dealing with some more examples and in-class case studies. A week from Monday, which I believe is April the 20th, your group PowerPoint presentation will be given for a grade. Okay, so what's going to happen is, I think April 20th is a Monday. Does that sound right? Just making sure the calendar's right. Okay, so on Monday, April 20th, you will have 10 minutes, right, for whatever company that your group has been assigned. And I'm going to have my iPad with a countdown timer of 10 minutes. And when it hits 0, you're done. I'm just going to cut you off mid-sentence. Right? There's no finishing on, or you're just done. And you're going to have to cover all 4 parts of the valuation, which we've done for McDonald's, which we're going to do for Apple, the EIC, the historical, the multiples analysis, and the valuation. Okay, so you're going to cover all 4 parts in a 10-minute PowerPoint for the company that you were assigned. Right? Now that's going to be done for a grade. Right? Now, 2 weeks after that, the week of May 4th, so either the 4th or the 6th, you'll do your company presentation for this section. Different sections have different days, but yours is going to be either on May 4th or May 6th for this section. Okay? So what will happen is on the 20th, the PowerPoint will be done in class for a grade as a practice, kind of a dry run for feedback, but it's the academic grading part of your group project, a good chunk of that. A week later, which I guess is around the 27th, the paper is going to be due. Okay? So you're also going to have to write up all of this and turn in your Excel models on your company as a group project. The following week, you'll then present this to the company. Okay? And then the week after that is the final exam, and then we're done. So we're kind of getting close to the wrap-up. So really, next week is more refined practice. Week after that, you're going to do your group project presentations. The week after that, your paper. Week after that, company presentations. Week after that, you do your final exam. Week after that, you graduate or start your summer break. Yes?
So is our final on the 11th, the last day of class, or is it on that?
So the way the final exam is going to work is it's going to be a take-home exam. It'll be given out on the 11th. You'll have 7 days to complete it, and it'll be a timed exam. So you'll have to work on it over a 4-hour period of time at your choosing during that 7 days. Right? So you don't have to do it during any exam window per se. So it's going to be a take-home, not an in-class final.
4 hours all at once.
You have 1 4-hour period to complete the exam. I'm not saying it's going to take you 4 hours, but I'm going to give you a 4-hour period to complete the exam. So you'll go to Canvas, you'll click on it, you'll start the exam, you'll have 4 hours, you'll have to finish it within a 4-hour period of time. Okay. Other questions? All right. So with that in mind, one other thing I do want to mention, and this is very critical, is that with the group projects, and this includes Stock Track, but it also includes the PowerPoint, what I had done in previous semesters is I made the entire team present, right? But in 10 minutes, you're not going to get 7 people to present in 10 minutes effectively, right? Because I used to give them 20 minutes, right? But what's going to happen with you is you're only going to have 10 minutes. So it's going to have to be much more concise, which means you're probably going to want to have 1, 2, possibly 3 people, but not your whole team present. Now, if you want to have the whole team present, you're welcome to do it. However, the project is a group grade. Now, here's the thing. There's going to be peer reviews, right? And what's going to be very important, because this has happened in the past, which is I don't expect that 1 or 2 people do the whole PowerPoint, write it all up, and then the rest of the people just get the grade. Because if I find out that happened, you'll get zeros, right? And 30% of your grade being a 0 will be a problem for you. So therefore, the peer reviews are going to be critical. So it is group grade subject to peer reviews. And if your peers say you did not participate or did not materially participate, I will not give you the same group grade as the rest of the group. So it is incumbent upon you to make sure that your peers feel that you've adequately participated. And if you did not, then that's going to be at your detriment. That also applies to Stock Track. So if you have one person in your group doing all of the stock track trades and you're not participating in that at all, and you don't even know your account, and you don't even know who your group members are, you're going to get a 0 for stock track. You're not going to get 10%. So you're going to lose an entire letter grade, and you cannot get an A in this class without completing the stock track assignment. So like I said, for both group projects, peer reviews are going to be very critical to your group grade. So again, you don't have to be the presenter in your group, but if somebody says, you know what, we had all these team meetings and this person never showed up to our team meetings, and we gave sections for people to write in the paper and they didn't turn in their section to write on the paper. And same thing, if they were supposed to create and brief me for the PowerPoint and they didn't do their jobs and I don't even know who they are, then that's going to be really bad for your grade. So it really does need to be a group grade, even though parts of your group as a team will do different parts of the presentation. So I'll just leave it at that. But as I said, it's not too late for you guys to get involved with your groups, but you really need to treat this like a group project. Yes?
We present to the company. We also have 10 minutes.
Yes. So the way it's going to work with the company presentations is you'll have 10 minutes plus another 3 to 5 minutes of Q&A. So essentially it'll be about a 90-minute time period that you'll present to the companies. Right? So again, we'll figure out the exact date and time for your section, but like the other sections, some of them we already have the date and times established. Okay, good question. Other questions? All right, so let's talk about the Apple fix. So first question, did anybody figure out what the fix was? Anybody saw the fix? Yeah.
It wasn't their balance sheet with...
It was what?
If you go to their balance sheet, and I'm just finding it right now.
Okay, so look at the balance sheet.
What I did all MH just to show the equations.
Mm-hmm.
So basically it just like shows you everything at once. And then
So would you do MH?
Alt MH
Alt MH.
just shows you all the equations.
I don't know how to do that on my Mac.
Oh, well if you go to formula
Yeah,
and then show
that formula
on the green bar,
on the green bar, formula. Yeah.
show formula. Like if you
Oh, show right here. Got it. Okay.
and then it shows everything basically like all at once, and I was just skimming through it basically, and then I looked at
Well, just cut to the chase. What was the missing field?
Well, one of them it was adding and subtracting a few things onto it.
Okay, that's probably not going to get us to the right
I
answer.
don't know.
So what's going to get us to the right answer? Yeah. So basically, let's go back here and get rid of the formulas here. So if you go to the Model Data tab, row 78, I had to add, and this is what I posted in the export file from Bloomberg. So for your group projects and for your next homework assignments, you're going to need to make sure that you add this row, and it's called prepaid expense long term. Yeah.
When you add that in and bounce the TFI, how in the world do you bounce the TFI?
Okay, let's go back to that. I'll get that in a second. So this was the missing item, and it's BS underscore prepaid underscore expense underscore LT. Okay, so that is what was missing. All right. Now, here's why. And I just want to talk about this conceptually for a second. So a few weeks ago, as I was explaining why we need to do these converted statements, and I was giving you one of the benefits, and you're probably like, I don't really care about these benefits because I don't want to do this process in the first place. This is actually one of the benefits of the process that we went through, because we would have made a mistake in our model and we wouldn't have even realized it was a mistake, except when we get in front of a real world client, they would have noticed that it was a mistake, and that would have made us look foolish. And I'm telling you, early in your careers, you work for JP Morgan, you work for Goldman Sachs, and you make this kind of mistake, they'll just fire you, right? Because they're going to look bad, the firm's going to look bad, and these are the types of mistakes you don't want to make. And that's what I'm saying. This is an advantage of the process I gave you, because by seeing that the CFI didn't balance, we knew that a mistake had been made. If we don't create the balancing statements, we have no idea that the mistake was actually made. Because even with the mistake, the way we set up the balance sheet of forcing the balance sheet to balance, we would have seen a balancing balance sheet. So I'll give you another example. In the first section, and I asked who fixed this, one of the persons fixed it by basically plugging excess cash. So what they did is they took the formula for excess cash, when we solved for it in the first forward year, they just copied and pasted that backwards, and they solved for getting the balance sheet to balance by just plugging excess cash to make sure the assets added up. Right? Why is that a bad idea? Why would that not be the fix? To solve for excess cash is the fix. Just plug it.
It's going to be running between the companies.
Yeah, I mean, the company's actual historical cash is the actual historical cash. And if we solve for the excess cash and get a different amount, like, that's going to be a problem, because what we're doing is we're saying that they have more cash than they actually did. So that would have been a problem, is we can't plug for cash. And by the way, that's the one that the company will truly notice. Because if we show them historical financial statements and their treasurer or controller or CFO sees these and sees that cash balance and says, we didn't have that amount of cash, your credibility will evaporate immediately. So we can't just plug for excess cash. So here's what I did, right? So what I did is I just looked at the difference in the, because I looked at the CFI. As I said, it's a good sanity check. If you get your CFI to balance in all years, including historically, you're probably on the right track. It didn't balance originally. So then, and then here's the advantage. I then know that the CFI is based on the TII and the TFI. I went to the TII. The TII balanced, so I knew it wasn't an income statement problem. The TFI didn't balance. I knew it was a balance sheet problem. So I went to the balance sheet, and I looked at the difference in the balance sheet, the difference in the TFI. Okay? And what I noticed was that that number, when I went to Apple's statements in Bloomberg, was actually one number. And that just happened to be the prepaid expense long-term. That was the exact number it was off. So it was actually easy to identify it that way. But as I said, this was sort of an accident, but it was a good process. And I'll tell you exactly how it happened. So when Bloomberg changed its financial statements format about a month or so ago, I told you they used to have these standardized format, and then they went to this adjusted format. What I did when we set up the McDonald's model is I tried to go through, when I created this tab, all of the items that were on the adjusted template. There were like 70 of them on here. And that was the problem. I missed one, right? Because there were just so many in a row, and I skipped over one. It was this prepaid expense long term. But here's the thing. It was 0 for McDonald's. So everything balanced. And it wasn't until we brought in Apple, where that number was not 0, that we realized that there was a mistake in our model. And that's what I'm saying. It would have been really easy to miss, and I could have solved it by plugging, but that would have been the wrong way to do it. So I'm just telling you, the balancing part of the model actually really illustrates when you make a mistake and when the Lego's actually on the floor, because that was the problem. There was a Lego on the floor. So I identify that, very importantly, in your Bloomberg template. That should be row 78, the very last item, so that way when you do your assignments, you export it and it's there. So then the question is, how do we hook it to the balance sheet? I took the lazy way out. I went to the balance sheet, and then what I did is I said, okay, I'm going to call that a long-term asset, and I just took the long-term assets, and I added in model data tab, row 78, C78. Okay? So that was the easy way to do it. Now, you could have also done it by just inserting a row and then just adding that to a balance sheet item. Okay? And then sum that up to the new total assets. So there were two ways to do it. The advantage of the way that I did it is that our TFI already accounts for row 13 on the balance sheet, other long-term assets. If you had added a row 14, let's say you'd inserted a row and put it there, then what you would have then had to do is you had to go onto the TFI, and then you would have had to account for that item on the TFI. So you would add another row to the TFI under the long-term assets. Then what you would have had to do is go onto the CFI, and you would have had to put the change in that item into the CFI, right? And that's why I said I was being lazy, because if I had actually done that, then I would have had to change the balance sheet, the TFI, and the CFI. By hooking it directly into something in the balance sheet that was already picked up on the TFI and the CFI, I just made one change. Both of those are correct, right? But I'm just saying this is the approach that I gave you in the fixed statement. But what's most important is we have now accounted for all of the items on Apple's balance sheet. I'm probably 98% certain that I didn't miss anything else. But as you do your group projects, if I did, check to make sure that you have a valid model. And you'll know, and as I said, the easiest statement is to look at either the free cash flow or the CFI, and when those don't balance, you know that there's usually a problem in your model. If those balance, then you're likely got a correct model, right? And so that's what I said, it's just a good sanity check on the modeling process, and that's what worked out. So as I said, if you were able to fix that in your model, use your model. If not, you're welcome to use the Apple as-is file, which has the fix and is ready to go. All right? So the next step would have been, after fixing the model, we had to come up with an Apple share price that we were trying to model was $127 a share. So started working on the assumptions to get us there. So first thing, and we did this in class on Monday, we put in their WACC, we put in their shares outstanding, we then put in from the EEO screen, the estimated sales and EBITDA for Apple, and then I added to the assumptions, just because you're going to do this for your next assignment plus your group project, we had to figure out the estimated margin, right? So that was the EV to sales and EV to EBIT. Now, yesterday when the power went out, I took a screenshot. I posted it on Bloomberg, so I used the data that was in that screenshot. Okay, so basically at the time their EV to sales were 2.51. Now that's the 2016 forward year one, so we're using the second year forward. And the EV to EBIT was 8.53, divide 29.4%. So that was the estimated margin, EBIT margin. Then we had to estimate a G, a long-term G. So here's how I did the G. For tax rate, I need an estimate of the tax rate. So what I did is I went to the ratios, and I used the 2015 forward tax rate as the estimate. Because what I really want is what I think the market is going to think that Apple's tax rate is on a go-forward basis. And when I looked at 26.3, which was the average of the 6 years, it looked pretty reasonable, particularly because the last 3 years, 25.2, 26.2, 26.1, said that 26.3 seems pretty reasonable to me. Now, obviously, if it was different, I could plug in a different assumption, but and I could put that directly here, but I just pulled that assumption from the ratios. Because like I said, I want the expected tax rate going forward when I do a forward multiple. Then I needed to figure out the estimated operating ROIC for the business. All right, so what is the operating ROIC for Apple on a go-forward basis? Well, I pulled this off of the EOI as opposed to the BOI tab. Okay, specifically, I went to the EOI tab, and I went to row 15, and I went to H15, which was the 2015 operating return on invested capital after goodwill. So two things. Why did I use EOI versus BOI? Well, in this case, the primary reason is we use BOI primarily because we wanted the model to balance the two valuations. That's why we did the BOI economic profit and the BOI ROIC, because that's the only way the DCF and the EP valuations actually balance. However, when people actually evaluate companies, they'll often use either an average ROIC, which is the beginning plus ending divided by 2, or they'll use an end-of-year capital. Because the whole point is, if we use the BOI, we're taking the company's capital that they're spending in the current year and we're ignoring it. Right? We're not charging them for that. Where most people say, no, from a valuation standpoint, I should charge them. So that's why we either use the EOI, the end of year, or we use an average of the year. Again, being a little lazy, I didn't do the average. I did the end of year one. But that was the point, because Apple's spending similar amount of capital expenditures, and I saw that off the free cash flow every single year. So using an end of year seemed reasonable, because I don't think they're going to suddenly slash their capital expenditures. Right? So with that in mind, it basically says that going forward, I got to figure out what a go forward ROIC represents. So I looked at 225.8 and I said, this is a crazy, ridiculous ROIC. And then I looked at 235 and I said, this is a crazy, ridiculous, a little bit more ridiculous, but still ridiculous ROIC. Like I said, I'm not talking about the difference between 25 and 30%. I'm talking about the difference between 225 and 235%. So as I looked at the out years and I saw 225, 235, 234, 230, I said, you know what? I don't think there's much of a difference. 225 seems like a reasonable ROIC to represent the future, which basically says Apple's got a ridiculous ROIC on a go-forward basis. All right. Now, That's why I used that number. But what I'm really trying to represent is something reasonable. And I think that Apple will maintain a ridiculous ROIC into the future for the following reason, which I'll ask you. Why does Apple have such a ridiculous ROIC? And I'll give you a hint. It's not the profit, it's the invested capital. Apple has very little invested capital. Why? And as you think about this. Total funds invested, operating invested capital for Apple in 2014 was $19 billion. That's their invested capital. When we did McDonald's, just to put that into perspective, when we did McDonald's, their invested capital in 2014 was $27 billion. McDonald's, which has revenue of $27 billion, has almost double the invested capital of Apple, which has revenue of $228 billion. How does that happen? Yeah.
Is it because Apple keeps all their cash overseas where they can't bring it back?
It's operating, so the cash is not the key. But it's why they have so much cash, because they don't have to spend on capital. What allows them? And it does have to do with being outside the U.S. What is it? Yeah. It's very cheap to make overseas, but here's the key. Is Apple actually building the buildings and hiring the couple 100,000 people to make their products overseas? They're working with a company called Hanhei Precision Manufacturing, also known as Foxconn. And Tim Cook, which is probably why everybody thinks he's such a financial genius, set up this partnership a long time ago, right? And the whole idea is they've outsourced to Foxconn all of the investment. So that's the point. They do have a few 100,000 people making their phones and computers and tablets. They just don't have to pay and hire and implement that, because they said that's not our core competency. And they were able to find a Chinese company who was willing to put up all of the capital and hire all of the people and do all of that investment at a very low price. Right? So that's the point. Apple is getting all of its value because they said the real value is not the manufacturing. The real value is the IP, the design, the marketing, the brand. And we'll get somebody else to do the manufacturing, and they did it very cheap. So not only did they cheap, they did it with no investment, because they didn't have to pay for the inventory. They didn't have to pay for the equipment. They didn't have to pay for the land and buildings. They didn't have to hire all the people. So that's why they have such low invested capital, and that's why their ROIC is ridiculous. So the real question for Apple is, 5 to 10 years, do you think that Apple's going to decide to go into making their own phones? So I don't think so. I think that if they had to go hire a few 100,000 people tomorrow and figure out how to make phones, they'd be screwed, because it's not something that they know how to do. So whether it's Foxconn or whether they swap to somebody else, somebody's going to do it. Same thing. They don't make the chips for the phone. Who makes the chips? Believe it or not, Samsung. Their biggest competitor for phones is actually making the innards for the phones. So what Apple will do is they'll design the chip, but then Samsung makes it. So that's the point. They design, they don't build. Okay? So they get somebody else to do the build. That reduces their invested capital. So that's the point. I think that somewhere in this ridiculous range it's going to stay, because they're going to keep that philosophy going forward. So when I do all that, we solve for the growth. And so what we did is I solved to match their EV to EBIT off the screenshot was 8.53. I got to 8.54 by getting a negative 0.55% growth. That's my CVG. I got an email from somebody yesterday who actually got something similar to that. They said, is it okay to have a negative growth into perpetuity? Yes or no? Yes. Is it okay to apply that to Apple? Does this mean that Apple's going away? The answer is no. So interpret this. What does this mean? Yeah.
Based on the current, numbers, they would be decreasing growth, but in the future, something's going to change, I guess.
That's right. That's the key. Based on the current numbers, they're going to have decreasing growth in the future. Apple is peaked. That's what the market is saying. The multiple and the growth rate being negative says this is the best of times. They're not going to do as well in the future into perpetuity as they're doing today. So the metaphor that I used earlier, whether you agree with it or not, I'll give you an opinion on my metaphor. But when I visited Rome for the first time, Rome, Italy, we wanted to go see the Colosseum. So you walk down this kind of road, sidewalk, as you're heading towards the Colosseum, and there's a bunch of people dressed up as like gladiators you got to avoid because they're just trying to harass you for money and stuff. And one of the cool things, though, is they have these giant stone-carved murals. And these murals represent the rise and decline of the Roman Empire. So you see a mural from like whatever period BC, and there's not much of the Roman Empire. You see another period a couple hundred years later, and the Roman Empire is big. Another mural, and it expands. And then you see another mural, and it then kind of declines very rapidly. To some degree, this is Apple is the peak of the Roman Empire. Like, this is as good as it gets. These are the good old days. This is as financially good as any company that's $220 billion is probably going to perform. And so that's what the market's saying, is that it's not that Apple won't be around, it's just Darwinian. Everybody's going to eventually face a decline, and that's what Apple's going to have. It's not that they're going to go away, it's just they're not going to do as well as they're doing right now. And they're firing on all cylinders. And that is what that negative growth rate represents. Now, it's not whether the market is right or wrong with this, but let me give you some insight into this. So, if I look at Bloomberg, and I look at Apple, and I go to the FA screen, and I go to the segments, and then I look at by segment numbers. Look at this. iPhone revenue, $102 billion. Right? Number of iPhones sold, 169 million. 2009, 13 billion in revenue, 20 million phones sold. So an average sales price, $629, peaked at $650, already down to $603. Right? And that's what I'm saying. The market is saying, you know what? You're already starting to see, even at their peak, that the average selling price of the iPhone is starting to come down a little bit. It's probably going to come down more with more competition. But that's the other question. Can this level of growth of $102 billion continue? Right? Knowing that everybody else has got phones that are just as good, knowing that you got a bunch of low-cost Chinese clones that people are starting to gravitate towards, are they going to be able to maintain their price premiums? Second, look at what happened to the iPad. 5 years ago, it didn't exist. Then, $5 billion in revenue year one, peaked at $32 billion last year, $30 billion this year. Within 5 years, this already slowed. Look at the iPod, which used to be the majority of their business. Revenue $8 billion, down to $2 billion. Look at iTunes, $4 billion to $18 billion, still growing. But that's the point. The engine of their growth has been the iPhone. All of their other products before them eventually peaked and started to decline, including the iPad. Is that going to happen to the iPhone? All right, and I think if you think what the market is saying with a negative growth rate, the answer is yes. That they're not going to maintain the market share, the price, and the growth. And here's the thing. On Friday, the watch comes out. Right? Do you think the watch is going to be $100 billion in revenue? So that's the question. As the phone declines, will the watch replace the phone sales? Right? So that's what happened. When they thought about the iPad, would the iPad continue to grow to be as much as the phone? What we're now starting to question is, maybe not. So that's what I'm saying. When you start to think through the as is, what I think the market is looking at is they're basically saying, yes, they've pulled some rabbits out of the hat. And they have pulled more rabbits out of the hat than everybody else. Because 10 years ago, they were a $30 billion company. 10 years later, they're a $220 billion company. It's never been done. And what I'm telling you is, it's going to be hard to continue. And I think that's what the market is really saying. So therefore, they're saying that Apple's peaked. Not that they're not going to do well, but they're just going to have more of a flat than a growth. But by the way, to stay flat, they still got to find $200 billion of hardware sales to push out the door every year. So that's the point. The new innovations are just replacing the previous innovations, where before it was an and. It was iPad, then iPhone, then, iPod, iPhone, iPad, iTunes, now iWatch. But I guess what their market is saying is the watch is probably not going to be as big as what you're going to start to see declines on. Now that's out to be determined. And that's what we're going to do when we do the final valuation. But that's really where this G comes from. So here's the point. I then go to my ratios. Tax rate I was okay on. I get a sense of what my EBITDA, therefore my EBIT needs to be 29.4 eventually. So I slowly work it down to 294 by getting my EBITDA from 34.6 down to 33.7 over a couple years. Generally, I needed to get the revenue closer to 2%. I was lazy. I probably shouldn't have just dropped it to 2 and left it at 2. I could have gradually declined it 4, 3, 2, 1, something like that, right? But nonetheless, somewhere in this range of very low single-digit growth and slightly lower margins explains their current share price. That's the as is. And as I said, you could have numbers somewhat near here, and that's okay. Because as you vary the growth rate and as you vary the margins, you're going to get slightly different, but you're going to still come up with the same story. That what the market has believed is Apple's peaked. If nothing else, it's law of large numbers. And therefore, that's how they came up with the value they did today. So that's the as is. Questions about that? All right. So my question to you is, do you agree with that? Is now the time to buy Apple because the market's got it wrong and that they're going to grow and maintain margins and they're underpriced? Is now the time to get out of Apple because, like great technology companies before them, Darwin's taking over and they just can't maintain the growth, particularly the phone, which is really half their business. And as the phone sales start to decline and mature, that they're just not going to make it up with something else, so you should get out? Or are they going to have enough innovations to maintain or replace the phone so that they stay along at this rate and keep generating huge amounts of cash flow? Because again, if you look at the CFIs, they're going to generate a staggering amount of free cash flow, $50 billion a year. Just put that into perspective. Free cash flow, $50 billion a year. And that's what the market's saying is not going to grow past that. If you look at Apple, they're not spending much on CapEx. They're spending 3 times as much as McDonald's on CapEx, and as a company, they're 10 times bigger. In a technology-driven world, are they going to eventually have to spend more on CapEx? So again, these are the questions that we need to figure out answers to in order to properly value Apple. So what do you think? What's your gut feel before we get too deep? Buy, sell, hold. All right? Why? What's your rationale?
Just because I feel like with all the competition in the market, they're going to have to either lower their price or introduce some type of innovation. But I don't really see a lot of possible innovation that they can do just because like the watch has already been done and it's not as, I don't think it's as big.
Okay? Yep.
I would say buy. I think Apple Pay is going to provide a lot more revenue for them. Maybe more, I don't know if it's the watch, but I think supplementing everything together. Then the new TV service later this year. I think like the new Apple TV thing they're like getting.
Well, let's be really clear. Apple is not going to introduce an actual television. Apple will never introduce a television. I can say that with pretty good certainty as an outsider.
Content, like I think online streaming and something to like get into it with
Like- Like they have their own like the Roku. I think that's
yeah, they have like a
Yeah, they have an Apple TV, like Roku box. Actually, I have one at home. It's really cool. Hook it up to my stereo and TV and can do all the stuff I need to do with the box. All right. But by the way, why will Apple not introduce a TV? Did we talk about that in here? I did in the previous class. One of the things I think Tim Cook truly understands, and I think Steve Jobs before him understood, is the 2 drivers of ROIC, which are what? What are the 2 drivers of ROIC? Besides tax rate. How quickly we forget. Margin and cycle time, productivity side. How much you make, how often you make it. Okay, remember that for the final exam. Anyways, those are the 2 drivers of ROIC. How often do you buy a TV? Anybody know the answer to that question? for American? It's 8 years. Basically, the average American keeps their TV for at least 8 years before they replace it. How often do you buy a phone? Less than 2 years. Would you rather sell devices that people replace every 2 years or every 8 years? What's the problem with the iPad? How often are people replacing their iPads? That's the problem. Is that Apple thought the replacement cycle on the iPad was going to be much faster than it was. And that's why they're less concerned about the iPad, because people are switching from the iPhone 6 from the iPad Retina Mini. Right? From Apple's perspective, is that good or bad? Yeah. They're going from the Retina Mini to the iPhone 6 Plus, the big 6. Because I actually bought the big 6. This is the 6 Plus, right? And it used to be a big phone. To me, it doesn't even seem that big anymore. You kind of get used to it. Kind of the big honking Samsung phone, same idea. You just get used to it. But here's the thing. Ever since I had an iPad, I barely use it. Because this phone is big enough that it does almost everything I need to do on my iPad. So here's the thing. Do you think Apple's concerned about that? That people are buying the 6 Plus versus the iPad Retina Mini? Because what did they just do? Yeah.
They just basically turn their iPads into iPhones. Now, the second time's
Exactly. They took a device that people were buying once every 5 years and turned it to a device that people are buying every 18 months. And they're getting a higher margin on the iPhone and the iPad. So as we said, when it came to, do I want to let my competitors cannibalize me, or do I want to let the innovation drive my business model? Apple said, I'm not going to be bound by, hey, my iPad sales fall a couple $1 billion. That concerns the market. Because what I did is I got more iPhone sales, and I get those people that are buying things in a much faster cycle time. Think about the watch, right? So what's going to happen with the watch on Friday? Forget the price. Just think about the ROIC, cycle time, and margin. How often do people replace those Apple Watches? Once a year. If you actually look at the way Apple is selling them, they have bands. But every band is the exact same size that will plug into the actual device. That device, read the reviews that came out today. Everybody said, has promised, wait for generation 2. That watch is going to last you for 12 months. At the end of 12 months, you're going to need a new watch. It'll be the next generation watch. So you just buy the new watch, put it on that band. So that's the point. They're giving you another product that you're going to have to upgrade every 1 to 2 years because the existing one is going to be obsolete and not usable. And that's the point. They want you, like a rat spinning a wheel, to keep spinning that wheel over and over and over again. Yeah.
What about the whole rumor that Apple was going to make their own car?
Not going to happen. Apple will never make a car. I mean, they might make one to test, but they're not going to actually make a car. Just like Google will not make a car. This is on YouTube for anybody in the world to see. Here's why. Apple doesn't know how to do manufacturing. Google doesn't know how to do manufacturing. It's not what they're good at. What are they going to do? They're going to partner with Tesla. They're going to partner with Mercedes. They're going to partner with other companies, and they're going to license their technology. So that's the point. They're really good at the tech to do this, but the actual manufacturing, 3 million cars, look how much trouble Tesla's trying to get at scale, and they're making 10,000 cars a month after about 5 years. You really think Apple and Google want to get into that business? No. What they want to do, same idea, is they want to license everything and control the tech and the high price and make ridiculous returns on investment. So absolutely, they're going to make a self-driving car technology, and then they're going to license it to partners that will actually manufacture it. That's what they're going to do, right? So that's the thing. Think about the Apple TV. What Apple's doing with the Apple TV is they're trying to control the ecosystem of the content on a tiny device that they don't even make, right? Because the value's in the content, the value's not in the device, right? And oh, by the way, in order to use the Apple ecosystem, it prevents you from going to Samsung phones, so it keeps you on the buy a new phone every year and a half treadmill. So that's the point. Apple's business is to use the software and the services to make you buy more hardware. So, and the hardware needs to be at a fast replacement cycle. So that's the idea. Every 2 years, new Apple TV comes out. You need super high 4K definition. Matter of fact, there's a rumor that they're now talking about 8K Max coming out within the next 12 months. So again, cycle time. They just want you to be rats running through, buying those products again and again and again. Serve them very well historically. Question is, are they going to be able to get us to keep buying? And here's the problem. They're going to saturate the people that have a lot of money, which means they're eventually going to get the people who don't have as much money, and that's where the price sensitivity starts to come in. And that's where, to maintain the volume, the question is, do you have to cut the price? And the people that were low cost, are they starting to catch up with them on the quality and the perception and the branding? So that's what we got to figure out when we figure out whether or not Apple's a buy, sell, or a hold. Right? So that's what I said. Your perspective that I'm hearing, if I read between the lines, is that Apple will come up with enough innovation to maintain what they have, as opposed to decline. All right, but that's the hold. That's the hold. That they're just going to kind of maintain this going forward. But that's to some degree what Microsoft did, and then their stock price flattened right off. Right? So the question is, can they keep going? Where's that next? And start thinking about the dollars associated with that magnitude of growth. Because they're now more than double the size of a Google and double the size of a Microsoft. And those companies are pretty big and successful. So they got to keep finding that growth. Put it this way. Look at these numbers here. In income tab. To go from net income, revenue, fields aren't big enough. But to 2017, 2018, they got to grow by almost $4 billion. That's 2% growth. That's $4 billion of revenue. By the way, that's 3 Twitters. That's the growth they need. All right? So that's what I'm saying. The magnitude of how big they are, I think, is what the market is starting to look at. All right? So, again, and with the watch, the question is, what are those sales going to look like, and are they going to be big enough? By the way, is anybody in here planning on buying a watch? Apple Watch? Just curiosity. Anybody enthusiastic about it? Anybody excited to see it? You are? Why?
If I had money,
Assuming you have the money, but yeah, why?
just be interested. I mean, they've made enough innovative products. Like, I would be shocked if it was successful.
Okay. But I'm saying, assuming you had the money, would you buy it on launch day? Are you excited about it? Enthusiastic? You still want to see it? Okay, yeah.
I would consider, but the way you put it with like they keep replacing it year over year makes me think I'd be buying the first bulky iPhone.
You are.
Yeah, so.
Actually, one of the reviews that I read this morning about it came out that said it was surprising how thick and bulky it was. And that's not the Apple-like experience. So I'm already telling you, watch Generation 2, not so thick and bulky. Reason to buy the next one. Right? And it's just nature of technology. They're going to figure out a way to get smart engineers to shave a little bit off, but that's how they're going to get you on that cycle. And so that's the point. The 2 will be there just when you get to the 3. Oh, and then the 3 has this that the 2 didn't. I mean, that's what they do. That if you think about Apple, part of their choice that they make for you is they give you just enough to keep you happy, but not everything you want. And the reason they don't give you everything you want, reason to buy the next one. If they give you everything you want, there'd be no reason to buy the next one. So it's basic. They're more business people than people give them credit for. They're very good business people. Matter of fact, their marketing is genius. I'll give you an example about the iWatch that I gave to the last class that I think demonstrates their marketing genius. So they have 3 editions of the watch as I was trying to do my research on this to try and figure out what the market might look like. The ridiculous one is the $10,000 gold one. Has everybody seen this thing? And yeah, so it's, what do they call it? The iWatch edition or something crazy like that. I think that they did that as a red herring. They don't care if anybody buys that watch. Right? Now, to be clear, on Monday, I was watching the TV show The Voice, and Pharrell was actually wearing it. Everybody noticed that. He had a gold edition iWatch on the Monday Voice episode. Right? And actually, a couple text blogs picked up on that. They started showing pictures of that. So, in any event, so it's out there. But the point is, there's a few Pharrells out there, and there's not a lot of rich, crazy people. In fact, I remember going to Taiwan not recently, and has anybody heard of the Virtu phone? Heard of Virtu?
Is this the one with that's ridiculously expensive?
Yeah, these are like $15,000 to $30,000 phones. So I was in the Taipei 101 Center, and there's a Virtu store, and I'd never been in there, so I said, let's go in the Virtu store. And they actually handed me a $15,000 like jewel-encrusted phone, and my hand was shaking. I was like, if I drop this thing, do I have to purchase it? Like, who's crazy enough to buy this? And there's a very super slim, like the 1% of the 1% that will buy this. And I'm telling you, Apple doesn't care about that crowd. They're not interested in that crowd. Here's the genius, I think, of Apple's, this is my opinion, of Apple's marketing. And it has to do with the watch that I am wearing. Okay? So this is a ridiculously expensive watch, right? And I did not buy it to basically see the time. Okay? And this is I'm just going to be very honest and candid to the world on YouTube. This is the vanity approach to this watch. So prior to this watch, which I got about 3 years ago, the last watch I got when I got out of college, and it was like a $125 watch, and it was perfectly fine, and I was happy with it. As a matter of fact, most of the time I use my phone for this. But I have a friend of mine, and I deal with a lot of senior leadership at a lot of companies, and what he told me is that they actually look at your watch and they judge you the second you walk in the room. And your watch, if you have a shitty looking watch, then they will have a negative connotation to you. That is his view, and whether you believe it or not, it matters. So men, women in particular, look at not just your watch, they look at your shoes. So also, don't go in with ratty shoes. So you need good shoes and a good watch. And the same thing, men compliment the women on the shoes. Even if you don't understand, they care about the shoes, and you got to say good things about the shoes. And this is the stuff that you think doesn't matter, but it does. So here's the point, especially if you're going to work with a Wall Street crowd. They're all about showing out the bling. You got to show off that if you have a ratty looking watch, they're going to think that you don't know what you're doing because you can't be successful, because you can't make any money, because you got a ratty looking watch. So you got to look like you make the money even if you don't. I know this doesn't make any sense. This is the real world aspect of this. So here's the thing. So he's like, you got to buy a nice watch. And I was like, I don't really want a watch. What's wrong with my phone? He's like, it's nothing to do with the watch. It has to do with your perception when you walk in that you want people to think that you're successful. So long story short, he is crazy about Swiss watches. Like the watches that he wants to own are $30,000 watches. Like I could buy a car for $30,000. Why would I want to buy a watch for $30,000? He's like, because that will demonstrate success and you can do all these things. I was like, there's no friggin' way I'm going to buy this. So he's like, all right, well, why don't you buy a Rolex? Because if nothing else, it's a brand everybody knows. Well, I don't know if you've looked, but Rolexes cost starting at like $8,000 for like the lowest end model. And they're ridiculously expensive, right? As a matter of fact, I was watching Better Call Saul. If you saw the Rolex Scam, that was the whole point, is that they were scamming people by selling fake or stealing fake Rolexes and getting people just with the brand name to perceive, oh, it must be an expensive watch because it's a Rolex. So, long story short, I'm not going to spend $7,000 on a watch. I ended up spending a couple $1,000s on this watch, right? And I still regret it to this day because I think it's worthless because the watch, first of all, it's a Swiss watch, Tag Heuer, doesn't have a battery. So if I don't wear this thing for 24 hours, I got to wind the damn thing and reset the time. It's annoying. And in order to buy a winder, I'd have to spend $100 to wind it every night. And who wants to do that? And then I have to put it in. So I was like, why do I do this? So I bought this watch purely, and I don't really like this watch, but I only wear it because I spend so much money on it. I feel I must wear it to get the value out of it. But here's the point. I started to think that spending a couple $1,000s on a watch was a good deal. Why? Because I didn't have to spend $30,000 on a watch, and I didn't have to spend $10,000 on a watch. What's the Apple Watch Edition all about? It's a $10,000 watch that makes looking at spending $700 to $1,000 look cheap. It's purely for perception. That's the only reason that they're selling the Apple Edition watch. Because if they didn't come out with a $10,000 watch and they came out with a piece of equipment that you had to spend $1,000 on, you would say, that's a ridiculous amount of money. There's no way I'd spend it. But by giving you a $10,000 option, you're going to say, wow, I got a deal. I only spent $1,000 on my watch. You kid me not. There are real smart marketing geniuses at Apple that figured that one out. All right? And that's the thing. They're going to have the sport watch at $350. They're going to have the next watch up at like $700, and they got the upper one at $10. The whole point of this is to get you to the $700 watch, which, by the way, you got to replace once a year. That's why I don't think this company's going away. But I wonder how much they're going to grow with that strategy to people that don't have the money. So that's the problem. I think they've saturated the market of people that have the money. Will they go down? That's what we got to figure out when we do the valuation of Apple. Anyways, by the way, if anybody wants to buy this watch, I'll sell it to you. $20. $20, sorry. I'll just keep it because I spent too much on it. but that's the thing. I would be interested in the Apple iWatch from a technology standpoint. But so I could have waited a few years, bought it, and people would actually think $700 is cool, and I would save a lot of money. But I would have had to wait for years for my ratty Seiko. Anyways, so back to this. Where were we? Oh yeah, 5 forces. EIC. We need to do an industry analysis. So I want to look at the current. And then I want to look at the in 5 years. And then I want to look at buyers, suppliers, substitutes, entry, and exit, and rivalry. Rivalry. By the way, tuition, higher education schools, same thing. Anyways, back to this. So, if I look at Apple and its peers, let's look at RV, and then I do custom, op, ROIC, then I look at WAC. What I basically see is that the Bloomberg peers for Apple make ridiculous ROICs. Right? Still, I mean, 31% starts to look bad at Cisco, even though 31% is really good, right? Particularly against cost of capital. So that's what I'm saying. We thought fast food had a good spread. This industry is also going to have a good spread. It's about as 5 as you get. Why? Why is technology such a great industry? Yep.
It changes.
Given the 5 forces.
Oh, the 5 forces.
In context of the 5 forces, why is technology such a great industry? Yeah.
Entry and exit, because it's extremely
Entry and exit is what?
expensive for intellectual property.
Okay, so call that a 5. So what's interesting is that software startups, you think that that would actually make it easy to get into the business. Is it? It's very few that actually become mega successful when you actually think about it. And here's the problem. A lot of the software, which makes it hard to get into, isn't just selling to me and you. Who's probably a bigger consumer than you and I? The businesses. There used to be a saying in 1982 that said, you don't get fired for choosing IBM. All right? And in a way, you don't get fired for choosing Apple to basically put in your business. Just like you didn't get fired for choosing BlackBerry a few years ago. And that's why it took BlackBerry so long to get kicked out of corporate America despite the inferior technology, because they were so ingrained, because you're not just changing the behavior of one person, the infrastructure, you're doing tens of thousands of people. All right? So here's the problem. You're a software startup, you come up with the next big thing, you go to Pfizer, you go to their CIO, you can try and convince them to bring that out to 50,000 people worldwide. They're not even going to talk to you. So that's one of the barriers to entry and exit that also really occurs in this industry, is once you're ingrained. Think about SAP, which if you haven't heard of SAP, they basically power corporate America's back office. Trying to rip out SAP basically shuts you down. So they're around for a very long period of time with competitive advantage, because coming up with a competing system is very difficult. And part of the reason you know that is because there's a famous story of Nike a few years ago where the SAP implementation went so awry that for 1 month, Nike couldn't ship any sneakers worldwide. Shut them down because they screwed up the SAP implementation. And Nike lost hundreds of millions of dollars because their entire business came to a screeching halt because the software was poorly implemented. They had to go fix it. So what I'm telling you is it becomes so core to your business, and you hear these horror stories and it's so bad to get in that ripping it out becomes even harder. So they're entrenched. Same thing with Microsoft. That's why Windows is still a long-lasting monopoly despite technology moving on, because they're so ingrained in what people use and the software that it supports. So I think that the barrier to entry and exit are actually much higher than most people think. So let's go forward. What else about the industry makes it attractive? The other 5 forces. Yep.
Substitutes.
Give me a number.
4.
Okay. So why aren't there a lot of substitutes?
I think as a consumer, you get into a certain interface, like Windows or Mac, that you typically don't want to switch.
So owning the ecosystem is really critical because it's so hard to switch across ecosystems. By the way, Apple's an ecosystem company. That's what they're all about because they want to keep you in that ecosystem. They don't want you getting out of that ecosystem. Google is increasingly becoming an ecosystem company. All right, and that's the point. It's competitive advantage, which makes it, as you said, harder to do substitutes. Buyers. Do we as buyers have a lot of power over these companies, and are we exercising it? Survey. How many people in this room have an iPhone or a Samsung Galaxy? Right there, it illustrates we have no buyer power. Because you just bought one of the 2 most, outside of the crazy Virtu phones, you just bought the 2 most expensive phones in the market. You can buy cheaper phones. And the point is, we choose not to. You can buy a BlackBerry, which does a lot of what the iPhone does. Right? You can buy a Microsoft phone, which I assume it doesn't crash anymore. I don't know. But nonetheless, it's cheaper than either of those phones. So we're not just doing it on price. So that's what I'm saying. If the buyers really had power and you didn't buy a Chinese knockoff clone, what is it? The company X? How do you pronounce that? X? Who is it? Yeah, that has like really low-cost phones. You know, you're not buying those. Right? You're not buying the cheap other phones. You're paying the premium brands. That suggests that we're not exercising a lot of buyer power here. Which also suggests that the rivalry is probably not as intense as we otherwise would think. Because they're not competing on just price. Right? They're competing on features and functions, and the market is still growing fast enough that they don't have to fight to the death. Suppliers. Who are the suppliers of this industry?
Like Samsung makes the chips.
So to some degree, it's interesting that Samsung is one of Apple's biggest rivals, but they also make the chips that go into the iPhone. So it is a little bit of incestuous industry, but the chip manufacturers, who do you think really has the power? Companies like Apple, Samsung, or companies like Samsung, Intel? Yeah.
I think it's the companies. It's the 5 because I know Apple when they had a problem with their Sapphire, and the company that they were contracting, they sued them. They went bankrupt because they didn't do it like Apple wanted.
Yeah, that's actually a very tragic story for that company, and it'd be interesting to just go back and look and see how a company exercises power over a supplier. Read what happened to that Sapphire company. It's really sad for them. But I'm going to not say it's a 5. I'm going to say it's a 4 because I think there's one other big cost that these tech companies have, which actually allows their profits to not be even more ridiculous. What's their biggest input? Specifically, what do they need to fund the R&D as a supplier? It's people. It's wages. And I think that they're having to pay a lot of money for wages. And I'll give you an example. I don't know what your starting salaries are, but last semester in this class, we had somebody who was a dual major. He was an undergraduate business major here at Smith, and he was also an engineer, so he's going to get a dual degree, computer science and engineering. Right? His lowball offer from Bloomberg was 90. Google and Microsoft were at 108 and 110. 22 years old, coming out of college. Right? So I'm just telling you, you work for KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, my guess they're probably offering you 50s, around 60. You throw a computer science degree in there, you're going to get double. And that's a 22-year-old. Right? And what I'm just telling you is it's no longer that Wall Street's paying these high-priced jobs. It's all technology. And so that's what you're seeing here, I think, that's affecting these firms. There's a war for talent. In fact, I was reading today about what the millennials want is work-life balance. And I was joking with a previous class that when I was your age and I graduated, it was work, you didn't have a life, and there was no balance. Right? Where today, you guys can do things like get flex time. They'll feed you at the office. They'll worry that you're working more than 40 hours a week. Like, I don't understand that. But that's the world that we live in because, like I said, the power has somewhat shifted in the labor market because there is a shortage of really good tech-skilled workers, and they're having to pay a lot more money. So I'm not saying they're not making a lot of money, but I'm saying that that's pressure that's already on this industry that's probably lowering profits from being higher than they otherwise would, and it's interesting to see how it looks in 5 years. So that's the real question. Technology, what's it going to be in 5 years? Is it still going to be a great industry, regardless of the players? There might be some new players, but nonetheless, they're all going to make a ton of money. Or is this industry going to be a little tougher? Yeah. I'll let her go first.
I think there's going to be too much competition, and it's going to end up overwhelming their entire industry, so it might not be as attractive.
So you think the industry is going to be a little bit less attractive in 5 years? Okay. So, and your point of view is what?
I was actually going to say it's going to be more attractive.
You think it's more attractive in 5 years?
It will be more ingrained into our lives. Right now, they say we spend 60-80% of our day, looking at screens, or 60% of our waking time looking at screens.
That's kind of a scary number, yeah.
Yeah, and they think it's probably going to go up maybe even 80, and you're going to have it in your home. So if it's more ingrained in our life, I think it would be more lucrative.
Okay. That's scary that 80% of the time we're just going to be looking at screens during our waking hours, but yeah. Is it really 60%?
Yeah, it was. I think I got it from one of the speakers from Bloomberg, and he was saying that they projected it would go up to 80%.
So what happened yesterday when the power went out? Did you guys just start freaking out? You had a meltdown? Oh my God, I can't check my Facebook and Twitter. Yeah.
Well, speaking of that, I heard two professors talking, and they were on the older side, and they were saying how they just kept going with their class, and the newer professors just canceled class because they didn't know how to teach without the laptop.
That's interesting. So again, that is an argument that says it's going to be still ridiculously attractive. I think in your case, you're just saying less ridiculously attractive, but still pretty attractive. So we could do the rest of the analysis, but we might be saying, 4.8 on the low end, but still a 5 on the high end? This is going to be a great industry. And so here's my final question. What about Apple? Apple's competitive advantage, which they're firing on all cylinders right now, is that going to change in 5 years? Or will Darwin have not yet caught up with them? And are they going to be able to keep pulling the rabbit out of the hat? What do you think? 5 years from now? Because that's the key to the buy-sell hold, is what happens to Apple's growth and margins and return in 5 years, and what can they sustain? That's what we're trying to get back to. What does somebody else think about this side of the room? Not a right or wrong answer. I mean, you could say, I'm a Luddite and I'm damn proud of it. Yeah.
I don't know, I still find it hard to believe that they would be declining a whole lot in 5 years. That'd be the most important part. However, I do kind of agree with the general notion that they can't keep just being credible forever. So long term, I would definitely kind of look lower than that, but just for the 5 years purposes.
So are you basically saying, when we do the valuation, that you think that they're more in the hold, that this is probably somewhere telling the story?
Up until the end of our 5-year forecast, but then long term, I would probably look to decrease.
Okay. Because here's what's interesting. If they are able to maintain some rate of innovation, and they are able to get, let's just use CVG of, call it even 1%, and if they are able to grow at 3% a year for the next 5 years or so, it's $150 share price. And there's still upside in Apple. All right. So again, this is a very important conversation if you're really thinking about whether you want to buy or sell Apple, because there still says there's upside if they just do, and that's still underperforming the global market. They're just still doing a little bit better. And that's why I go back to, it's not just what's happening in the US and Europe. It's what's happening in some of these countries around the world that are starting to become much more successful. It's not just India and China. As I was telling the previous classes, Indonesia is going to be the 5th largest country by GDP pretty soon. So it's the Indonesias, it's the Singapores of the world. Not that they're a big economy, but it's those kind of Asian countries. The 21st century is the Asian century. Right? The 20th century was the U.S. century. We are on the decline. We are like the Roman Empire. We have peaked. We are on the decline. That's just my generation. We're going to ride it out, right? And I'm on YouTube. Why not? So I think the U.S. peaked sometime in the 1980s. So just like Britain was passed by the U.K. in something like 1876 in terms of economies, the U.S. economy peaked U.K. And ever since then, the U.K. was on the decline as from the dominant economic power. I think that's the stage that the U.S. is moving into. And it's not China. It's sort of China, India, Asia in general is where the balance of power is going to shift in the 21st century. So I'm just saying, if I were you, I wouldn't be looking at a U.S. company. I'd be looking at a multinational company because the opportunities are not just in the U.S. on a go-forward basis. They're definitely going to be in other parts of the world. So, and again, I think the only reason why we're not suffering more in the U.S. from a little bit of decline, and the reason why I picked the 1980s, is if you take out government deficit debt-based spending and all the debt that we ran up on our personal credit cards and home equity credit lines, the U.S. really wasn't growing. Like almost all our growth has been a debt binge. And so what we're doing is we're just riding out the future by paying and advancing the future into today. We're not growing when you take out all the debt. We're just maintaining and treading water. And the rest of the world is growing very rapidly. And that's the point. That's going to be the eventual balance of power shift. So here's the point. I think Apple, which has a lot of their sales, and when I go here, look at sales for Apple, FA, by not just segment, but by geography, 80 billion of sales was the U.S., which means 100 billion of sales is outside the U.S. So the one thing that Apple is also positioned on is to take growth in other parts of the world. So when we think about the shrinkage, yes, the U.S. market's going to be tough. But as these developing countries that are getting wealthier continue to grow, is that where they have that sort of export opportunity where they're already big that says that the growth maybe isn't shrinking, they haven't peaked because there's a lot of other people that can use this technology that can be part of their lives. Don't know, but that becomes an argument for a buy type of a scenario versus a sell scenario. That's what we got to figure out. So, anyways, long story short, here's how this ties into your assignment. So this should be fun. You should be excited about your assignment for Monday. All right? So your assignment for Monday is what I told you is the real value of the sell-side analysts is you get to sit at the center of an industry and learn what all the companies around you are saying and triangulate results. So to really understand what's happening with Apple, we need to know what's happening at Google. We need to know what's happening at Microsoft. We need to know what's happening at Samsung. To some degree, we need to know what's happening at Facebook. So here's what we're going to do. Your assignment for Monday is to take either Microsoft, Samsung, Google, or Facebook and do the same 3-file analysis that you did on McDonald's with one of those 4 companies. Right? So you got to do an as-is, full as-is Excel spreadsheet. You have to do a full final valuation, and you have to do the minimum 500-word paper, which means probably an 800 to 1,000-word paper, explaining the whole EIC, historical analysis write-up, multiples analysis write-up, and valuation. It's a dry run for your group project, but it's taking one of those 4 companies. Then during Monday's class, what I'm going to do is hopefully we have a distribution, so everybody's done at least one of those companies, and then, unlike this past Monday, I'm going to have one person from each company come up and get 10 minutes, and then you're going to basically go through everything and give your analysis of that company. But then we're going to go through all 4 right in a row. So that is going to help us better value Apple as well as those companies because we're going to start triangulating the points of view on all of these major tech players as opposed to one of the tech players. And just to see whether we're getting consistent messages or different messages and then how those valuations all tie together. Okay, so that's what Monday's about. I'm very excited about Monday. I hope you will be. It's a cool assignment. Now here's how the extra credit comes in. As a most likely final extra credit before the final exam, right, is going to basically be this. 2. Do 2 companies. So 1 company is the homework assignment. If you want to be ambitious and do 2 companies of that list, then that is extra credit. Okay? So the second company would be extra credit. What does the second company mean? It means 6 files. So 2 as-is Excels, 2 final Excels with all the supporting and corresponding correct data, and 2 minimum 500-word full write-ups. Right? And for the extra credit, Somebody asked in the last class, they said, well, can we just do the Excel file and not the paper and get 1 point of extra credit? And the answer is no. So to get the extra credit, you'd have to do all 3 and full assignments to be eligible for extra credit. So again, you don't have to, but for those of you that lost out on the power shortage yesterday, for any way, and you want to do another opportunity, that's another extra credit opportunity. It will probably be the last one before the final exam. Okay, questions? So Monday's class, as I said, all of this due for all sections by 10 a.m. Monday morning. I will either take volunteers or I will volunteer people based on your actual submissions, drag you kicking and screaming in front of the room, and give you the chance to go through your buy, sell, hold, and thorough analysis. And again, 10 minutes. So really, it's a practice run for your group presentation a week later. Now, here's the thing. I know that this assignment is somewhat group related, so I will let you talk to each other about this assignment, and you can help kind of shape each other's thoughts on this assignment. However, you must still turn in your own Excel file. You can't share the Excel file, and you must still write your own paper. You can't share papers, right? But if you want to talk to some of your group members, because it's very similar to the process you're going to do on your other company, you're welcome to do so. Because like I said, next week you should be transitioning to working on your group project, right? Questions about any of that? So I'm going to post it online, but your 4 company choices are basically Microsoft, Samsung, Google, Facebook, right? And I hope everybody doesn't say, oh, let's all do Facebook. Like, I hope we have a distribution of all 4 of those companies, right? Minimum of 1, extra credit 2. And somebody also asked this one, 3 is not extra credit. So 2 is the max that I will consider for extra credit. The second company is extra credit. Questions? I'm excited to hear what you have to say. See everybody on Monday.
So Microsoft, Samsung, Facebook, I would be all the